Malologist, paleontologist, environmentalist, global warming activist, former Australian of the Year, all-round legend, Professor Tim Flannery. Tim, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
Very nice to have you in here. Now, you've made that choice because back in the early 90s, when you were principal research scientist with the Australian Museum in Sydney.
Principal research scientist in mammals. That was
in mammals. That's a pretty good title.
Yeah, it was. It's a specialised field, I must say, but it was a lot of fun.
But it took you abroad.
It did.
To Irian Jaya, as it was then.
Yes, exactly.
Tell me about that.
Well, it was always, to me, the last frontier. You know, I worked on the border with Papua New Guinea for a number of years. I saw the refugees crossing. I looked over. I remember once in the Star Mountains, I looked across and there was the snow glistening on Mount Juliana way, way off to the west. It seemed like a mythical land and always impossible to get to because there was a civil war going on and the Indonesians weren't interested in having researchers there. And then things changed and there was a little brief kind of spring, really, period where researchers could get in. And I had some good friends at the museum in Bogor in Java, and they helped facilitate a permit for me. And in 1990, I made my first visit to Irian Jaya, and it was amazing.
So as a scientist, and seeing that as the kind of last frontier for you, what were you going in there expecting to see? Because you knew that part of the world well, you knew that part of the natural world intimately. What did you imagine would be different once you got in there?
Well, what's special about Irian is the mountains are just so high compared with Papua New Guinea, and there's such a vast area which is above the tree line, you know, right up in the alpine environment. And it was virtually biologically unexplored. You know, a group of Americans had been in there in 1938. There was one or two very minor visits since, but basically nothing done. So it's like walking into a new field. You know, anything could be there. And it turns out there was some pretty amazing stuff there. Yeah.
Describe that first kind of flight in there after so much anticipation.
Well, I remember landing in Jayapura, and it was a small and exquisitely beautiful city at the time. You know, the physical setting of Jayapura is a bit like Sydney. It's this beautiful flooded area with a magnificent lake behind. The only difference is the mountains go up 2,500 metres just behind the town. So it's like Sydney in Switzerland, really. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. I think it's probably changed now because the city's grown a lot, but back then it was small and exquisite. Landed there, had a few days there, getting permits, meeting people at the local university, then flew into a place called Wamena, which is the centre for administration of the highlands of Irian Jaya. It's in a magnificent valley called the Baleen Valley, up at about 1,500 to 2,000 metres elevation, so crisp air even though you're on the equator. People wearing penis cords, jogging down the street, you know, Indonesian military as well with their guns in hands.
So very much Sydney and Switzerland then.
That's right, yeah, kind of jogging down the street. And the place, incidentally, Wamena, is fascinating. It's called Wamena because the missionaries that got there in the 1960s and wanted to establish a base pointed to the ground and asked a Dani bloke, what's that? It just so happens there was a pig turd on the ground. So the Dani guy quite understandably said it's pig shit. And the town has been called pig shit ever since. So
a better reason for naming a town, I can't think of one. Exactly, that's exactly what you need.
Yeah. So we spent a few days there and then took a very small aircraft flown by the missionaries into one of the high valleys to a place called Quiawagi, and you fly up out of the valley. On the left-hand side is this huge peak, Mount Juliana, with snow, dusting of snow on it. There's a huge river system that runs through the Baleen Valley, and you watch as it disappears into the ground. There's a huge sinkhole that swallows a river bigger than the Murray River. Wow. And it's this thunderous great thing, you know, with the whole river disappearing. Many kilometres later it comes out somewhere else, but it's just an unbelievably spectacular country, you know. And then it opens up again and you see this valley with a river snaking through it as if it's running through the lowlands. But you're at 3,000 metres elevation, you know, and landed an airstrip and then a whole community, hundreds of people in grass skirts, penis cords, hooping and so forth, come to the airstrip to watch this rare event of an outsider coming to their part of the world.
You talked about that kind of political backdrop and the way in which it was the gates had opened and you're allowed in there. How much was that remarkable in terms of the way you were received as it being this rare moment? How did you find it explaining the purpose of your visit?
Well, it was very interesting trying to do that because I'd obviously come just out of nowhere as far as those local people were concerned. I couldn't give them any advance warning. The previous Europeans who'd been there were the missionaries, and they were there probably until the 90s maybe. I don't know exactly when they left, but there was no one there when we arrived. The local people had very fond memories of the missions, even though it was obviously a massive social dislocation when there was Baptist missionaries, incidentally, came in. Since then, what they'd seen of the outside world was basically the Indonesian military, for one reason or another, using Irian Jaya as their training ground and as their place where they're important, you know. So when we arrived, we were very warmly welcomed. I made 3 or 4 visits to the area, and with each visit my relationship improved until finally people started opening up to me.
Over what period of time was it?
About 3 or 4 years, or maybe 5 years.
Makes me think of that great Joseph Conrad line in Heart of Darkness, where the white faces are coming in bearing the torch and often the sword, and you're there bearing not the torch of the missionaries, but the torch of research and science and understanding. As they started opening up to you, how did that relationship evolve? Well, it was. We understood each other obviously much better as time went on. At first, all I could do was effectively do my work. You know, the local people took me out to a cave where there was fossilised bones. It was just incredibly exciting because there was nothing known of the fossil history of this area. And this cave was full of the bones of this gigantic marsupial the size of a bear, extinct for 50,000 years. You know, but can you imagine going into this cave and finding these bones? It was like an Aladdin's treasure for me, you know. I was going to say, radio is only an audio medium, obviously, but listeners should know that Tim Flannery's face just lit up like a child on Christmas Day, remembering seeing those bones.
Well, it was incredible. And it turned out the river itself was full of the fossilised bones of these animals as well. So I was able to collect them, describe these species, make them known to the world, collect some modern mammals as well. Local people helped me with that. By the time I got back on my second visit, though, my Indonesian had improved, and as well as I'd picked up a little bit of Dani, the local language, and I knew more of the history of the place. And so I was able to develop a deeper relationship. And on that visit, people showed me the insignias they had of the resistance movement. They talked a little bit about how passionately they felt that they weren't Indonesian, but they were Dani people who were very different, and they wanted a level of independence. I remember on my third visit, I arrived in the middle of a tragedy. There was a dysentery epidemic going around, and 7 children died in a week while we were there, and the cremations were going on all around us. I had virtually no medication. I managed to contact one of the mines in the area and had some medication sent in. Perhaps that cemented our relationship a little bit more. Sometime after that, I remember hearing the news that the settlement had been wiped out by the Indonesian military. They'd got in. I still don't know what's there to this day, to be honest with you, and who of those people I met survived. But it was just that little window when I could get in and do that work and meet those people. On either side of it was the chaos of civil war and all of the difficulties that brings.
You're listening to Blueprint for Living. I'm speaking with Professor Tim Flannery about his time in Irian Jaya in the early 90s. You may have read Tim's book about this experience, Throwaway Leg, which is a terrific account of it. But it means, Tim, I have to ask you about the tree kangaroo.
Yeah, sure.
Tell us a bit about that.
Well, one of the things that I was most interested in trying to follow up during this visit was to confirm the identity of a kind of tree kangaroo that appeared to me to be unknown to science. Now, this animal, it turned out, lived at very, very high elevation. It's the only tree kangaroo that lives above the tree line. And on my very first visit, I went up into this habitat. And I'd just like to describe what this place is like, because it's just one of the most remarkable places on Earth, and is why I chose to talk to you about it, really. So there you are in a valley at 3,000 metres, and you walk along a road, and there's a huge mountain range. The Prince Willem IV Range opens up to the south, and the lower slopes are densely forested with this magnificent old Antarctic beech forest, the sort of stuff you might see in Tasmania, except the trees are far larger and just imposing. Beautiful forest open underneath. It's land of the giants type stuff, you know. You walk through that and then start a day-long climb up this very, very difficult slope. I remember getting up and being totally exhausted, falling to sleep, and then starting up again the next day. Finally got up to the summit of the range, which is fairly flat, and camped in a cave up there. And it's one of the most strange environments I've ever been in. There's little tussocky plants that you realise are rhododendrons of a sort. Really beautiful flowers all over them. The weirdest plant in the world in some ways, the ant plant, which is a member of the coffee family, but it looks like a pot with a little stem sticking out with a few leaves on it, and the pot's got lots of holes in it that are inhabited by ants. There's an ant nest inside it. I mean, strange looking things, birds of paradise, honey eaters, animals that are unafraid of you because they don't see many people up at that high elevation. And of course it's really cold, particularly at night. The puddles freeze over. You could get snow, and yet you're on the equator. And
wow.
I remember staying in this shelter, lovely warm fire at night, and looking out through a curtain of vegetation hanging down with flowers on it, different flowering heath plants, and these birds coming to feed on these flowers less than a metre from my face. But they couldn't see me because I was inside. I got the most perfect view of them. It was quite incredible. So anyway, get up in the morning, have your coffee, and then wander off through this enchanted landscape towards the southern drop-off of the mountain. And I remember you go across a glacial pavement. This is where just 20,000 years ago there was glaciers flowing. And you'll see these stones that the glaciers dragged along still in the grooves they cut in the rock pavement. So there might be a bit of moss around, but nothing much else has changed. Right? These rocks still there as they were 20,000 years ago. Walking to the edge of this enchanted land and seeing a drop-off that is 4.5 kilometres. It goes down. So you're standing in what's like the North Pole. It's very, very cold, and you can see a tropical reef in the far distance. The whole of the Earth's cross-section is there visible for you, in terms of habitats.
What do you know about how much it's changed? Is it as isolated as it was, you think, early in the 90s, or has that period of relative openness led to a kind of fundamental change for the Guinea people, for that part of the world?
I'd heard that the settlement of Quiawagi was basically blitzed by the Indonesian military. I don't know whether anyone's still up at that elevation or not. I think the high country is probably still much as it was, although climate change will be affecting it, eating away at it. The rare tree kangaroo we found up there, this dingiso, this animal, it looks like a panda. I hope that's still there. I think it probably still is. There's giant rats up there we discovered as well. I mean, it was extraordinary. All the big animals of the alpine habitat, the big mammals, were undescribed, unknown to science until we went up there. It was just fascinating.
Tim Flannery, thank you so much for taking us to that part of the world today.
It's a pleasure, Michael.